All right, welcome everyone. We've got a pretty hefty stack of documents here. Budget estimates and projections, program breakdowns, the whole shebang.
We're going to be taking a look at the proposed budget, trying to figure out if it's all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, are they promising the moon and the stars, or is there some substance behind all these numbers? We're going to use three main documents to sort it all out. The PBB book, the estimates of revenue and expenditure, and the workforce budget.
Think of it like examining a blueprint, but instead of a building, it's a whole country.
And speaking of blueprints, the PBB book seems to paint a pretty rosy picture, right?
They're definitely leaning towards the optimistic side.
They're projecting GDP growth of 5.8%, aiming to keep inflation around 5%. Sounds pretty good on the surface.
It does. But we need to dig deeper and see if those numbers hold up under scrutiny. One thing that immediately jumps out is the emphasis on fiscal sustainability.
Keeping the country's finances in good shape, avoiding overspending, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But then you look at the estimates document and see their planned spending actually exceeds their projected revenue. So that raises some questions.
Can they really pull it off?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, can you have your cake and eat it too? Well, I guess that's what we're here to find out.
Yeah.
Let's start with those revenue projections. PBB book highlights a bunch of sectors they expect to see growth in, but are those projections grounded in reality?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's where the estimates document comes in handy. It breaks down the revenue sources in more detail, and some of those entries are a bit curious.
Like what? Give us an example.
Well, they're projecting significant revenue from bridge toll fees, but there's no mention of any new bridge construction in the PBB book. So where are these tolls coming from? Are they planning to start charging for existing bridges?
That could be a risky move, politically speaking. People don't always love new tolls, especially if they haven't seen any improvements to the infrastructure. And it raises an important point. We need to look beyond just the numbers and consider the potential social and political implications.
Exactly. A budget isn't just a financial document. It's a reflection of a government's priorities and its relationship with its citizens.
All right, so let's move on to how they're planning to spend all this money. The PBB book outlines their priorities: agriculture, education, health, and so on. But are they putting their money where their mouth is?
Let's dive in and see. Why don't we start with agriculture? The estimates document shows a pretty hefty $945 million allocated to agriculture for 2025.
That's a sizable chunk of change. What are they planning to do with all that money?
Well, there are big investments in livestock production, a significant amount allocated to relocation of services, and then there's this rather curious spike in spending on fish ponds and water breeding facilities.
Fish ponds. What's that all about?
It's a bit of a head-scratcher. The PBB book highlights their goal of boosting food security and modernizing the agricultural sector, so maybe they're exploring aquaculture as part of that strategy. But why the sudden emphasis on fish ponds? And what does relocation of services even mean in this context? Are they moving agricultural offices closer to rural communities, or is there something else going on?
Lots of questions there. Transparency is definitely key when it comes to these allocations. Now, what about education? Anything interesting there?
There are a couple of things that stand out. The estimates document shows a significant jump in school improvement grants, which sounds promising. But there's also a sharp decrease in support to victims.
Support to victims. Who are they referring to?
That's the thing. Neither the PBB book nor the workforce budget provides any specifics on this. It's unclear who these victims are, what kind of support they were previously receiving, or why funding has been cut.
That's concerning. It makes you wonder if they're prioritizing cost-cutting over the well-being of students who might be facing difficult situations. All right, let's move on to healthcare. Anything jump out at you there?
Well, one thing that caught my eye was the sizable allocation for R&D health, but the very small amount for public health services, IS.
So they're investing in future medical breakthroughs,
Yeah.
but potentially neglecting immediate healthcare needs.
That's one way to interpret it. The PBZ book does emphasize preventative healthcare measures like immunization and reproductive health services, so it's not like they're completely ignoring those areas.
True, but that funding discrepancy still raises some questions about their priorities. Are they striking the right balance?
It's something to keep an eye on.
All right, let's shift gears to one of the most important aspects of any budget: the bottom line. How are they planning to finance all this spending? What about that deficit?
The PBB book projects a deficit of D2.7 billion for 2025, and they're planning to finance this through a combination of refinancing short-term debt and relying on concessional external borrowing.
So taking out more loans, essentially. What if those loans don't come through as expected? Do they have a backup plan?
That's a good question, and it's a bit concerning that the estimates document shows a pretty substantial increase in public debt transactions. Are they banking on everything going perfectly, or are they prepared for some bumps in the road?
It's like building a house of cards. It looks impressive, but one strong gust of wind could bring it all down.
And that brings us to another critical factor, inflation. The PBB book projects a decline in inflation, reaching the central bank's target of 5% in the medium term. But are those assumptions realistic given the current global economic climate?
We're living in uncertain times with commodity prices fluctuating, supply chains disrupted, and who knows what else on the horizon. Are they factoring in those risks? What if inflation spikes?
The estimates document doesn't give us much detail on that front. It would be reassuring to see that they've considered those possibilities and have some measures in place to protect the most vulnerable if things don't go according to plan.
Right, like some kind of safety net. So we've got these ambitious development goals laid out in the PBB book, but then you look at the actual allocations in the estimates document, and some of those numbers seem a bit underwhelming.
That's a good observation. It's like they're setting these lofty goals, but then not backing them up with sufficient resources. Take social protection and poverty reduction, for example. The PBD book talks a big game about supporting vulnerable groups and tackling poverty, but then you see the actual amount allocated to the social welfare program in the estimates document, and it's shockingly low.
A mere D81,545. That's hardly enough to make a dent in a problem as complex and widespread as poverty.
Exactly. It raises questions about their true commitment to addressing this issue.
Are they just paying lip service, or are they
Wow.
serious about making a difference?
That's for the citizens to decide. A budget should reflect a nation's values, and if tackling poverty is truly a priority, then this allocation seems to fall short.
All right, let's talk about private sector engagement. The PBB book emphasizes the importance of the private sector in driving economic growth, but are they taking concrete steps to make that happen?
There are a few hints in the estimates document. There's an allocation of D6.8 million for support to local human resource dev, which could potentially fund vocational training programs and help equip people with the skills they need to succeed in the private sector.
That's definitely a step in the right direction. Investing in human capital is essential for a thriving private sector. But are they also focusing on things like improving the ease of doing business, reducing red tape, creating a more favorable investment climate? All those things are important too.
They are, and unfortunately, the estimates document doesn't provide much detail on those specific areas.
So like having a car with a powerful engine but flat tires.
Yeah.
You need all the components working together to get anywhere.
A good analogy. Now, what about public sector reforms? The PBB book mentions plans to enhance efficiency and accountability within the government, but are they walking the walk or just talking the talk?
Public sector reforms are notoriously difficult to implement. There's often a lot of resistance from those who benefit from the status quo. It takes real political will to push through meaningful changes.
Absolutely. The estimates document does show a slight increase in funding for national security operations, which could potentially be used to strengthen anti-corruption efforts or improve transparency in government procurement. But we'll have to wait and see if that actually translates into concrete results.
Right. It's not just about spending more money. It's about making systemic changes. Now, let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart: climate change. The PBB book acknowledges the importance of addressing climate change and transitioning to a more sustainable future. But are they backing that up with concrete actions?
The estimates document shows an increase in funding for climate change financing, going from D1.5 million to D2 million. But is that really enough to make a meaningful difference?
That's the big question. Are they investing in renewable energy, promoting sustainable agriculture practices, building climate resilience?
It's one thing to say you're committed to fighting climate change, but it's another thing entirely to actually put your money where your mouth is. We need to see a comprehensive and ambitious strategy, not just symbolic gestures.
Agreed. And last but not least, let's talk about trade. The PBB book emphasizes the importance of expanding regional and international trade, but are they putting their money where their mouth is?
In today's globalized world, you can't just say you want to trade more. You need a solid strategy and the resources to back it up.
Exactly. You need to invest in infrastructure, streamline customs procedures, make it easier for businesses to connect with international partners. Empty promises won't cut it in the competitive global marketplace.
Well, the estimates document does show an increase in funding for contribution to international org capital, which could be used to support their participation in regional trade blocs or to fund trade missions to explore new markets.
That's a good start.
Yeah.
But are they also investing in things like ports, roads, digital connectivity? All those things are essential for facilitating trade.
They are, and that's something we'd need to look into further.
So after all this, after scrutinizing all these documents, the big question remains, is this budget credible?
Well, it's a mixed bag, to be honest. There are some positive aspects, like the focus on fiscal sustainability and the investments in certain key sectors. But there are also some red flags, like the heavy reliance on debt financing and the lack of clear contingency plans.
So proceed with caution.
I would say so. This budget has the potential to set the nation on a path to prosperity, but it also carries some significant risks.
And that's where informed citizenry comes in. It's up to the citizens to hold their leaders accountable and make sure the nation's resources are being used wisely and effectively.
Couldn't agree more. A budget is more than just a bunch of numbers. It's a reflection of a nation's priorities, its values, and its vision for the future.
Well said. Now let's zoom in on some of those specific allocations that caught our attention, like those fish ponds and water breeding facilities, the mysterious relocation of services, and that curious drop in support to victims. Stick around for more.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about some potential red flags. But now let's zoom in on something that stood out in the estimates document. That funding for fish ponds and water breeding facilities.
Yeah, that definitely caught my eye too. I mean, enhancing livestock production makes sense, but fish ponds, where do they fit in?
Well, if you look closely at the PBB book, it mentions increasing the volume of poultry small ruminant meat.
Okay, so maybe they're lumping aquaculture in with livestock.
It's possible they are aiming for food security, so maybe this is part of a broader diversification strategy.
That makes sense. But what about that relocation of services allocation? That one's still a mystery.
It is a bit cryptic. The PBB book doesn't shed much light on it either.
Maybe moving agricultural services closer to rural communities.
Possibly. Or consolidating offices to save money. We just don't have enough information to say for sure.
It would be nice if they were a bit more transparent about these things. Anyway, let's move on to education. That drop in support to victims really jumped out at me.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. And unfortunately, neither the PBB book nor the workforce budget tells us anything about what that support entailed or why it's been reduced.
It's worrying, to be honest. It makes you wonder about their priorities.
Let's hope it's just an oversight and not a sign of a shift in their commitment to student welfare. Now, what about healthcare? We were talking about that discrepancy between funding for research and development and public health services.
Right, the R&D health versus public health services, IS. It just seems a bit unbalanced.
Well, remember, the PBB book does highlight preventative measures like immunization and reproductive health.
True, but it still feels like they might be putting too much emphasis on future breakthroughs while neglecting immediate needs.
It's a valid point. We'd need to dig deeper into the specifics of those public health services, IS, to get a clearer picture.
All right, let's move on to the big scary D word, debt. How are they planning to finance that D2.7 billion deficit?
The PBB book mentions refinancing short-term debt and relying on concessional loans from external partners.
More borrowing, essentially. But what if those loans don't materialize? What's their plan B?
It's not entirely clear from the estimates document. There is a substantial increase in public debt transactions, though.
So they're racking up more debt. That's a risky strategy, especially in these uncertain economic times.
It is. It's like they're assuming everything will go perfectly according to plan, which is rarely the case. And speaking of uncertainty, let's talk about inflation. They're projecting a decline, aiming for that 5% target.
But is that realistic? I mean, with all the global instability, the supply chain issues, the rising commodity prices.
It's definitely an optimistic projection. And the estimates document doesn't really address those potential risks.
What if inflation spikes? Do they have any safeguards in place to protect vulnerable populations?
That's a crucial question, and one that we need to keep asking. Now let's bring this back to their development goals. The PBB book makes all these grand promises, but do the numbers in the estimates document add up?
We've already talked about the meager allocation for the social welfare program. That doesn't exactly scream commitment to poverty reduction.
It does make you wonder if they're all talk and no action.
And what about private sector engagement? They say it's crucial for economic growth, but are they actually doing anything to foster it?
The estimates documents does mention D6.8 million for support to local human resource dev. That could be used for things like vocational training programs, which would definitely help.
Investing in human capital is essential. But are they also looking at things like improving the ease of doing business, creating a more attractive investment climate? Those are important too.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the estimates document is pretty vague on those fronts.
Okay, what about public sector reforms? Any sign that they're serious about making government more efficient and accountable?
The estimates document does show a slight increase in funding for national security operations. Maybe that could be used to bolster anti-corruption efforts or improve transparency in procurement.
Maybe. But we need to see concrete actions, not just increased spending. Are they actually implementing reforms, or is it all just talk?
That's the million-dollar question. All right, let's move on to climate change. They acknowledge its importance in the PBB book, but are they putting their money where their mouth is?
Climate change financing gets a boost from D1.5 million to D2 million, but is that enough to make a real difference?
It's a start, but it's hardly a bold statement of commitment. We need to see more ambitious investments in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, climate resilience.
Actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
Now, last but not least, trade. They talk about expanding trade in the PBB book, but do they have the strategy and the resources to make it happen?
Well, they've increased funding for contribution to international org capital. That could be used for participating in trade blocs or going on trade missions.
Okay, but what about investing in the necessary infrastructure? Ports, roads, digital connectivity.
Those are crucial, no doubt. And the estimates document doesn't really go into detail about those.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at their projections, their allocations, their debt strategy, their approach to key development areas. What's the overall verdict? Is this budget a blueprint for success or a recipe for disaster?
Honestly, it's hard to say for sure. There are some positive elements, but also some major concerns. The heavy reliance on external borrowing is a big risk. The lack of clear contingency plans is worrisome, and those revenue projections might be a bit too optimistic.
So proceed with caution.
Definitely. This budget could go either way. It really depends on how well they manage things, how committed they are to transparency and accountability, and whether they're willing to make tough decisions when things don't go according to plan.
And as always, it's up to the citizens to hold their leaders' feet to the fire. Demand answers. Demand accountability. Make sure your voices are heard. Now, before we wrap up, let's take a closer look at a few more specific allocations that caught our attention, like those medals and insignias, the special services expenses, and those curious bridge toll fees. Stay tuned for more. All right, welcome back. Before we wrap things up, let's dive into a few more interesting tidbits from the estimates document. First up, medals and insignias. Small amount, but still kind of curious.
Yeah, it's not every day you see that in a budget.
You wonder, right? Who gets these medals? What are they for?
Probably just routine replacements or maybe new ones for, recognizing people for achievements or service, that kind of thing.
Hopefully. But it would be nice to have a bit more detail, just for transparency's sake.
Agreed. Now, what about that funding for special services expenses? That one's a bit vague, and it's a pretty substantial chunk of change.
Special services. Sounds kind of mysterious, right? Secret missions. Undercover operations. My imagination's running wild here.
Let's not get carried away. It's probably just a catch-all category for operational expenses that don't fit neatly anywhere else.
All right. Back to reality. But still, a little more transparency wouldn't hurt. And speaking of things that need clarification, remember those bridge toll fees we were puzzled about?
Yeah, that one's still a head-scratcher. No new bridges mentioned in the PBB book, so where are these tolls coming from?
Existing bridges. That's going to be unpopular.
Definitely a politically sensitive issue. And it highlights the importance of looking beyond the pure economics, considering the social and political impact of these decisions.
It's all connected, right? The economy, politics, society. You can't separate them. Anyway, I think we've covered just about everything. We've examined their projections, their allocations, their debt strategy, their approach to all those key development areas.
Yeah.
So after all this, what's your final verdict? Is this budget credible?
Honestly, it's a tough call. There are some good points, some worrying points. It's a real mixed bag. The focus on fiscal sustainability is definitely a plus, but that reliance on external borrowing, that's a big risk. And those revenue projections, well, they might be a bit too optimistic.
So what's the bottom line? Should we be hopeful or worried?
I think a healthy dose of caution is warranted. This budget could be a springboard to prosperity, or it could lead them down a dangerous path. A lot depends on how effectively they implement it, how they handle unexpected challenges, whether they prioritize transparency and accountability.
And that's where we, the citizens, come in. We need to stay informed, ask tough questions, hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. A budget isn't just a document, it's a reflection of a nation's values, its aspirations, its vision for the future.
And it's up to all of us to make sure that vision is one we can all believe in. Well, folks, that's a wrap to this nation's budget. We hope you found it informative, maybe even a little bit empowering. Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these complex issues, the better equipped we are to make our voices heard and shape the future we want. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better tomorrow.